Hello, I'm Michael Voris.
And I'm Father Pablo, Catholic missionary priest. We really want you to watch every week the one true faith. Had you left that one true faith, please come home. We're waiting for you because we love you.
Hello and welcome once again to The One True Faith, the most disturbing hour on television because we talk about eternal life, the biggest, most important issue that any of us faces. Jesus Christ established the Catholic Church in order to teach, govern, and guide souls to heaven. That's the reason the church exists. It doesn't exist for any other reason. He's given us the sacraments in order to be tools for us to be able to get us to heaven. The Catholic Church has always taught this. There's nothing new in any of that. There are some people, however, who have disputed that from the very beginning and continue to dispute that today. And we have, hence, this little war, this clash of ideologies about what is the Catholic Church, who is Christ. Once you start asking those kinds of questions, you get right to the heart of what does it mean to me to be alive? Why am I here? What's the purpose of my life? Well, the Catholic Church has the answer for you in that. The purpose of your life is to get to heaven. If you want to get to heaven, the surest way to get to heaven is to follow what Jesus Christ told you to do. And quite frankly, the two things he told you to do are be baptized and eat his body and drink his blood. That's what he said to do. When it came to the part about eat my body and drink my blood, it says in the Gospel of John chapter 6, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. That's a very hard statement to square if you refuse to believe that that's possible to do on this earth. That's a very difficult thing. How do you eat the body of Jesus and drink his blood if you don't believe that his body and blood is present here on earth? It's a bit of a conundrum. It also doesn't seem very fair for Jesus to command people to do that and yet not give them a means to be able to do that. And make no mistake, he's not talking about spiritual. How do you spiritually eat somebody's body? That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make sense. There's no way to spiritually eat somebody's body. The statement doesn't make sense. So, what does that mean? It means that the Eucharist, what the Catholic Church calls the Eucharist, which is a word we get from Greek meaning thanksgiving, is the normal means by which humans are saved. That's the normal means by which humans are saved. Just as water baptism is absolutely required. It's the normal means by which we are saved. So the reception of Christ's actual body and blood is a necessity. In the normal course of events, it is a necessity. I say normal because there are obviously some people who will never have the opportunity to do that. Babies who are aborted, people, a young child who's grown up in a part of the world where he's never heard about Jesus and then, happens to die of a disease or something like that. So there are obviously exceptions to this. But for the people to whom this truth is revealed, they must accept and believe this truth and then conform their lives to it. For them, this is the way to heaven. And without this, there is no heaven. Christ makes this quite clear. There aren't 75 roads up to the mountaintop. There's one. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Period. If you love me, you will keep my words. The Eucharist, then, is going to be our topic for this entire fourth season of taping. And we have a very simple reason for this. The reason is that today, more than any other time in the Church's 2,000-year history, the Church is under fierce attack. Absolute fierce attack, demonic as they all are, but extraordinarily demonic in this time. If you were to sit down and tally up the number of blood martyrs, people who have died for the faith, you would find more people have died in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries combined. The church is under vicious attack, bodily as well as intellectually, spiritually, devotionally, and we have a recourse for that. This is why two great popes in the last century emphasized church teaching. We'll get to this in a little bit. Emphasized church teaching like no one, like it had. Had emphasized the church's teaching on the Eucharist, on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, really like no other popes really had emphasized it. Nobody emphasized this teaching and brought it about and made it so much more clear to us and continued to say how important the Eucharist is than the popes in the 20th century did. And they did it for a reason. Starting back with Pius X, back at the turn of the century, Pius X tells us that saw what was going on in the world. And we're going to review some of that. There was a period in the 17th and 18th centuries that history calls the Age of the Enlightenment. Ha ha ha. The Age of the Enlightenment. How funny that things that are oftentimes given the opposite name. The Age of Enlightenment is when the light went out, not when the light came on. It was part of the results of the Age of the Enlightenment was the French Revolution. And the period in European history where the wheels began to come off the wagon, and we are only now, 2 and 3 centuries later, realizing the full impact of what happened. There was a philosophy that sort of embedded itself into the European psyche called rationalism. And rationalism is when you start to be able to think things through yourself. And that's all you need. There's no authority. You become your own authority. And in the world of religion, you become your own pope. Of course, the seeds for the Enlightenment were planted during the Protestant revolt of the 16th century. But a couple centuries later, here you have that, and then a couple centuries after that, which is our modern day, all of a sudden, the wheels are off the wagon. Practically nobody in Europe goes to church anymore. And why? Because I don't think I have to. Because it's not a necessity. Don't you tell me anything about God. I know about God. You can't tell me anything there is to know about God. I'll make up my own mind. I, after all, am an enlightened, Age of Enlightenment, rational being who can figure things out on my own. Yeah, how's that working for you, Europe? Now, the seeds for this destruction were planted, and the destruction began, but it didn't happen all at once. All of these things kind of take time. They take time. And the 18th and 19th centuries sort of set the stage for this to begin. Lots of people say, well, how did we get to where we are now? We didn't get here overnight. This took a few centuries to get to this point. At the beginning of the 20th century, Pope Pius X smelled a rat. Absolutely smelled a rat, the way things were going. He looked out over the world and he said, you know what? There's a mindset developing among human beings. There's a mindset developing that is saying that is going to, if you carry it out to its logical conclusion, that mindset is going to challenge the very idea that there is even a God. You can see it starting to develop. So he wrote an encyclical, which is just a big fancy word for a letter, condemning what he called modernism. Now, what's modernism exactly? Modernism is essentially people sitting around thinking that they know the truth, and Christianity has become a subjective reality. I'll decide what Christ is, I'll decide what my relationship with Him is, and I'll decide how I'm going to respond to that relationship, and I'm going to decide if I ever even actually have to have a relationship with Christ. That's modernism. It takes on a whole bunch of different names. Secularism, rationalism, there's a whole bunch of names for this. We see it all developing now. It is now coming to fruition. This was an evil garden planted by Satan a few centuries ago who just sat back and let man's natural tendency take over, knowing that if you can separate man from God in his mind, separate man from God in man's mind, then you'll achieve exactly what you want to achieve. And for him, of course, that's separation from God for us. When you are a modernist, you don't need the church. You don't need the Pope. There's not an awful lot that you do need. Pope Pius X saw that the attacks that had begun would actually wind their way out of the world of of human society and start to drift over into the world of religion and theology. And the first place that got attacked was the sacred scriptures, the Bible. The Bible is the first place we see the attack happening. And Pius knew that once people's belief in the Scriptures and the authority behind those Scriptures was undermined, that the whole religious framework would come crashing down. That people would live however they wanted to because they would be the ultimate people to decide how they were going to live. It's why he wrote the letter 100 years ago. So here's what happened on a historical level. Scholars, and we'll put that in a great big quotes, scholars started using their rational minds, because they were now so much more enlightened, to conduct research on the Bible. Research is what they call it, research. Their research was skewed, and it was skewed deliberately. They did not go to study the sacred Scriptures to find the truth. They brought their truth, predetermined and in error, to the Scriptures and plugged it in wherever they could find it. They denied the miracle accounts, for example. They explained them away. The miracle of the loaves, perfect example. He's like, what's he exactly talking about? Here's a good example, miracle of the loaves. How many of us have heard that stupid thing that, well, Jesus didn't really multiply the loaves and feed 5,000 people. The real miracle is that he got people to share their bread with each other. How many people walked around carrying loaves of bread and fish in their pockets for the day? And had 12 baskets left over. Come on. Well, that's an example of it. They called the stories myths. And the process they set about was they wanted to demythologize the Scriptures. They wanted to get the truth of the Scriptures. So Jesus didn't really walk on the water. It's a story that the apostles wrote just to kind of tell people, well, we really like him, so we're going to make up a story and say he walked on the water, because he didn't really walk on the water. No miracles, in fact, happened at all. People weren't cured. The apostles simply expressed their love and their warmth and their admiration for this this guy named Jesus who had a great personality. And he said some nice things. Love your neighbor, isn't that nice? And that's really all the Scriptures are. This is what happens when you apply rationalism and modernism to the sacred Scriptures. In fact, Jesus didn't even rise from the dead. His distraught apostles just imagined. They loved him so much. They loved him so much that when he died, they just couldn't fathom the idea that he was dead. So they all sat around in groups imagining that he was standing there talking to them. This is modernism. This is modernism. Matter of fact, there's one school of modernism that actually says Jesus didn't really die, didn't rise from the dead, because he didn't really die. The Romans didn't actually finish him off. Now, if you know anything about history, the Roman execution squads were brutal. Nobody got off a cross alive, and they made darn sure of that. No one got off a cross and lived. But aside from that ridiculousness, back to our other ridiculousness, some people say that he didn't rise because he wasn't really God. Ooh, now see how Pius X, see how his view of what would happen starts to develop. How many biblical scholars today will say something like, Jesus didn't really know that he was God. What? What? How could God not know something? If he's God, he knows everything, and if he's not God, he wouldn't think he was God, unless, of course, he was a modern biblical scholar. At least some of them. So here we come to it. Christ is not God, and that bread that you Catholics eat is not Christ. That has been the aim of this scholarship and this school of thought from the very inception of it. And the reason why is because this was a blueprint. This whole thing, the Age of Enlightenment, modernism, rationalism, secularism, the whole thing was a lead up to this attack on the divinity of Christ, the incarnation, and his presence in the Holy Eucharist. And of course, who dreamed it up? Who dreamed it up but our favorite guy from Scriptures himself, the serpent sitting in the garden. That's who dreamed this up. Why? Because what does he want more than anything else? He wants to deny God worship. What does he say to God in the desert on the third temptation? See all these cities? Bow down and worship me, and I will give them to you. Satan wants worship because his pride is that huge and swollen. He fell out of heaven for it. You'd figure he'd have kind of learned his lesson, but he's that stubborn and that prideful that he wants worship. And if he can't get it directly from you, and he does get it directly from a lot of people today, but if he can't get it directly from you, then he at least wants to divert you away from worshiping the true God. And that's what's going on. That's what's been going on for, well, actually from the beginning of time for humans, but most especially now in this age. But there was an answer for Satan's deceit, waiting for him out in the desert when the Hebrews started disobeying God's commands. God said, I'm God, here's the law, you follow it, this is it. And they said, no, we're God, we'll do our own thing, let's make a golden calf. We're going to worship a golden calf. There's a little bit of something that they had to pay for that. God sent serpents among them to bite them. And when you got bit by the serpent, you died. Isn't it fitting, of course, that it would be a serpent that God would send to them that would result in their physical death? And more to the point, Christ had an answer. God the Father had an answer for Satan's deceit to turn worship away from him in Sinai. And what did he use? Of all things, he used a serpent. He told Moses, fashion a serpent, a bronze serpent, and put it up in the niche of a tree. And anyone who looks on that, who's been bitten, will be healed. Later on, in the Gospel of John, Jesus equates himself with that serpent. He says, when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. 3 times he used that curious expression, when I am lifted up. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. What did he mean by that? Well, he certainly was talking about his own death, lifted up on the cross, being crucified. He also meant that his resurrection, when he is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. But if you notice, he didn't say, when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself and I will save them. He didn't say that. He said, I will draw all men to myself. And he did that on Calvary. He drew all the archetypes of mankind to himself, all of them, sinners, repentant, and unrepentant. And when it's all said and done, those are the only types of human beings there are, repentant sinners and unrepentant sinners. Now you're probably thinking, what on earth has this got to do with the Eucharist? Well, we're getting to that. We'll be right back right after this. Welcome back to the One True Faith. We are talking about the Eucharist, and we're focusing on a comment that Jesus made 3 times in the Gospel of John. 3 times he refers to himself being lifted up. Lifted up. When I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. The first way we can understand that comment is in reference to the crucifixion. It's probably the first most easy way to understand it. It was referred to as being lifted up. So when Christ was lifted up, who was there? Who was there? He said, I'll draw all men to myself. So who was there? Well, the faithful were there, first of all in the person of his blessed mother and the disciple whom Jesus loved. So of all men who are there, well, the faithful are there. Who else is there? Well, the state was there. The government was there, going about their dirty business of political expediency, doing what's best for the people so that the people will keep order and we won't have to deal with the mess. I'm going to wash my hands of this, however, because, we didn't do anything. It's the expediency of the state. So the state was there. Society's elite. Oh, the elite were there. The people who know everything. The people who know everything and can recognize everything and have all the street smarts in the world, but have no soul. They were there. They were dressed very fashionably also. You can bet your bottom line on that. Making fun of everything that was holy. And they would have been impressing the crowd with their great intellects and their witticisms and all of that comes along with being sort of the elite. Oh, they were there. There were also the passers-by. Gospel makes a special point of saying that where the crucifixion happened was the junction of a number of roads where people just walked by. Lots of people walked by. That's why Pilate wrote the sign in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, so all the people passing by would see. These are the people who are uncommitted. They need something to talk about, so they just sort of stroll by and they stop for a moment, and you have their attention for just a quick moment, and then back onto their lives. There was the bad thief. We know who that person is. That's the cheat. That's the person who's always looking to capitalize on the moment, always looking for the angle. That person was there. But there was also the good thief. Well, the good thief who looked beyond the physical appearances of what he saw and knew behind the physical appearance was God. He was there. He would be a symbol of all who would revert to the truth when times get desperate. And thank God for desperate times, because people convert and revert in desperate times. And then, of course, there was the soldier saint, Longinus, the Roman centurion, who had charge of this crucifixion. He would forever be the symbol of all converts, overwhelmed with grace, because he was willing to believe. He was willing to believe. When I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. And Christ is still being lifted up today. Still happens. He's still lifted up on the cross today, continuing to draw all men to himself. Nothing's changed. Everyone comes to that cross and they make a choice. They make a choice about Christ. Islam rejects him. The Jews disown him. The secular West laughs at him hanging up there on the cross. The modernists, the cool biblical scholars who are just too smart for the Bible, too smart for the church, too smart for 2,000 years of tradition. What is this Christ nonsense, this dead Jew that you all worship? He didn't even know himself that he was God. See, we've proved it. We've had a committee, and we have figured out that he didn't know he was God. We've written a report on it. You can find it in Time magazine. I'll decide who Christ is, these people say. He's the warm and fuzzy Christ. He's the good philosopher. He's the guy that everybody likes to invite over for dinner, but don't say anything that disrupts anything. Oh, no. Don't say anything that bothers people. He's the God of my own personal interpretation of Scripture, and that's all I need. Don't tell me about God. Don't tell me about His truth. I determine the truth. Who do you think you are, Pope, telling me what to do and what to say and what to think and how to pray and how to worship? I am an enlightened man of the 21st century. I don't need your medieval garbage and your spooks and your incense and your smoke. I am an enlightened man. I am to think that people could actually worship a piece of bread in the 21st century. Tisk, tisk, tisk. There are the soldier saints today, as well as the good thieves, and the faithful followers, those people who still stand there, and they are different from the rest. They are different from all the rest. All men drawn to Christ lifted up. But there's a difference. And what's the difference today? They believe. They believe. The faithful followers of Christ believe. And you, my faithful followers, are you going to leave me too? No, Lord, to whom should we go? You have the words of everlasting life, and we have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Holy One of God. That's the difference. And what do these believers believe? What is it they believe? What do they see when they look at Christ raised up? What are they seeing? Obviously, they're seeing something different than the scorners and the mockers. Remember when Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved are bolting to the tomb on Easter Sunday morning, and the disciple whom Jesus loved was younger, and he got to the tomb first and he waited, and Peter went into the tomb, and then that disciple looked into the tomb. The Gospels make a very clear point of saying he looked in the tomb and he saw and he believed. He saw and he believed. What do faithful disciples of our blessed Lord see today that they believe? When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. 3 times he uses this example, these words. Christ uses these words in the Gospel of John. Where do the faithful find Christ being lifted up today? Where is Christ lifted up? This is my body, which is given up for you. That is where the faithful followers of Christ see Christ today lifted up. And they gather, as men have always gathered, at the foot of the cross. When the priest says those words of consecration, and all heaven bows down before the altar of the living God. If you are faithful and you believe, you are there. If you are unfaithful and you don't believe, you're also there. Oh, but how you're there is the hitch. How you're there is the hitch. Christ makes himself physically present in heaven, and on earth when the priest speaks those words. And he brings a reality, a fullness, a completion to the prayer, Lord, teach us how to pray. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Christ is on earth and in heaven at the same time. In the Eucharist, there is Christ himself truly, really, and substantially body, blood, soul, and divinity. It is Jesus Christ who was born of the Virgin Mary, whose hands cured people and then were nailed to a cross, who died, who was put in the tomb, and that body came walking out on Easter Sunday morning. That is the Eucharist in the Catholic Church. It is Jesus Christ, period. It is not a symbol. It is not a representation. It is not a feel-good thing. And I do not make it happen, and how I feel about it doesn't affect the truth of it one iota. It is Jesus Christ. I will not leave you orphans. I will come back to you. He keeps that promise today, not 10,000 or 100,000 years from now when the world comes to an end, when all of a sudden he comes back. I will not leave you orphans. I will come back to you, and he is back with us, body, blood, soul, and divinity, truly, really, and substantially. The faithful abide by him. They stand there at the foot of the cross. The sinners, the unrepentant sinners, the repentant sinners say to him, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The convert says, truly, this is the Son of God. But the world wants nothing to do with the Eucharistic Lord because they want nothing to do with God. Protestants mock him in the Eucharist by yelling, Catholics say that bread is God. Let's see if God comes and proves himself. The curious, the passers-by, stop just long enough to sort of check things out and then get on their way. Their way to where? To wherever they're going, that they will never change their lives and amend their lives, sadly. And what of the followers of our blessed Lord, this special crowd who have a great intimacy with Christ, who by their betrayal have delivered him into the hands of his enemies? What of the modern day Judas? those who are the absolute closest to him should be and deny the truth of his presence in the Eucharist. Well, where was Judas on Good Friday? He was a rotting corpse, not too far away, swinging from a tree by the neck, because he would not believe in the Eucharist. Go back to chapter 6 of John, after Jesus reveals that he will give himself in the bread and be the bread for the life of the world, and his flesh will be sacrificed, and that this bread is his flesh, and you are to eat it. He gets done revealing all of that. And he turns to the apostles, as I said a little earlier, and says, "Now will you leave me also?" And Peter, as usual, speaks up, "Lord, no, to whom should we go? You have the words of everlasting life, because we have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Holy One of God." And Jesus says, "But did I not choose you 12? But not all of you believe, for one of you is a devil." Make no mistake, Judas was not swinging from that tree when Jesus was hanging from that cross because he betrayed Jesus. He betrayed Jesus because he would not believe what Christ had said. It's the first time in Scripture that you get a hint of why Judas did what he did. "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you." John chapter 6. "When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. Some will stay, others will walk away." And the point of departure is belief, is faith, is faith. It's so striking to me in the work we do here at St. Michael's Media, it's so striking to me that the number of people that we come in contact with who will believe virtually anything about Jesus, that have such great faith in his presence in the Scriptures and his presence in their hearts and his presence in their families and his presence in their worship, will not give him the respect and the honor due with his presence in the Eucharist. Why will you not believe? Why will you not believe this command of Jesus Christ? For those who look on him lifted up and believe in his real presence, there is a grace 4 times over that comes to us. If we are open to his real presence, we receive the grace called realization. We receive the grace of realization that we are able, if we are willing to believe, knock and the door shall be opened to you. If you are willing to believe this, Christ will infuse you with grace to be able to believe it. Our example, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, it was the gospel on Sunday. What did he want to do? He believed. He believed enough to go climb his short little rump up that tree and take a look. I said, "I believe, I want to see, I want to see." And what does he do? He comes down and he makes a profession of faith to Christ. The grace of realization. The loved always wants to be near the love. There's another grace that comes to us, the grace which simply comes from Christ being physically present in our midst. The source of all grace, right there in our midst. We get that grace. The example from Scripture, Jesus is working his way through the roads crowd. He's on his way to Jericho, and there's a woman who believes and says to herself, "If I can just touch the hem of his garment, all I have to do is just touch the hem of his garment." And she touches it, and Jesus turns around and said, "Who touched me?" And the gospel says, because he was aware that power had gone out from him. Just being in his presence gives us grace. We call this emanating grace. It's like a nuclear radiation. It's like a reactor gone wild. And we get to sit and absorb that grace. If you sit in front of this radioactive blast furnace, we get graces as the individuals for that. We get individual grace from that because we who are so loved want to be in the presence of the source of our love. We get individual graces for that so that we will be inspired to do the good works that Christ commands us to do, and standing there in the presence of the light of God, our minds become more illumined with the light of Christ, and we begin to see things the way they are seen by the Holy Trinity. That's the reason He's here among us. He's not here because He likes hanging out in His little condo called the Tabernacle. He's here for us. He's here for us. He wants us to come to Him. Everywhere in the Gospels, people come to Christ, constantly coming to Christ. Do this for me, do that for me. My mother-in-law is sick, my son's sick, my daughter's dead, my child, my servant is cured. That's all He wants. Come to us, come to me. All you who are labored and weary and find life burdensome, come to me. That's what He wants. That's why He puts Himself there. Why would the all-loving God reserve His physical presence for just the first generation of Christians? He's here physically present with us for all generations of Christians. And for those of you who happen to hear people say, oh, well, the only reason that we reserve the Blessed Sacrament isn't to go worship it, the reason we reserve it is just for the sick, that's not true. That's not true. We don't have time to develop this here in this show. But that simply isn't true. Pope Pius XII in 1947 wrote an encyclical tracing the history of Eucharistic adoration. And it goes all the way back to the early times of the Church. So if somebody tries to pass off to you and say, oh, well, that's not, it's just for that's why we just keep it over here on the side. We take God Almighty and shove Him in the corner because He's just there in case you're sick. That's ridiculous. This practice of adoring our blessed Lord in the Eucharist is called, fittingly enough, adoration. And it is a complete act of adoration, since what and who we are worshiping is the author of grace Himself, of all life. This is why we can confidently ask Jesus for our needs, because we're standing at the source of all grace. This is what happens repeatedly in the Gospels. As we said, people come to Him and say, give me this, give me that. Now, there is one remaining source of grace, and that is grace that comes to other people when we approach Christ and pray for them. Remember and they don't have to know about it. They don't even have to like it. Many times they wouldn't. Remember when Christ was preaching in the house, and they brought the paralyzed man, and they pushed him, they opened up the roof and tore the roof apart and lowered him down through the roof. Nowhere in the Gospels are you going to see that paralyzed man asked for that to be done. And even once they lay him on the mat in front of Christ, he doesn't look up to Jesus and say, cure me. What makes the man be able to get up? The faith of those who brought him to Jesus is what makes the man get up and be able to walk. He didn't ask to be cured. He didn't ask to be brought. He probably actually thought it was kind of a pain. Oh, leave me alone. You're going to lower me through the roof. And what are you doing? Stop it. It was the faith of those who brought him to Christ. So when you have the ability to bring people to Christ in the blessed sacrament, in His real presence in the Eucharist, do not think for one moment that Christ will deny your request. He will very much answer your request. Bring your unfaithful and walked away family members, people who've left the faith. Bring those people who you love to Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. Bring them to Him because you are conforming yourself to the will of God. Because when Jesus says, and when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself, His will is that all of those people who come to Him will be faithful and not one of them will be lost. We get to stand at the foot of the cross. We get to stand right next to Jesus Christ Himself in person, in flesh, and pray for other people. There is no greater thing on earth we can do than that. We're going to take some questions from the studio audience. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back, everyone, to The One True Faith. It's time for the Q&A part of the discussion. What's your name? Where are you from?
I'm Ed from Lapeer.
Hello, Ed from Lapeer.
those that leave Mass after communion,
Immediately after communion?
are they fulfilling their obligation for the Mass on holy days and on Sundays?
If they got there before the reading of the gospel and they stayed through the Mass, they're fulfilling their obligation. They're not being very polite. They're not realizing what they've just participated in, because anybody who just took Jesus into themselves, that person is now a living tabernacle. And for them to want to not even take a moment to say thank you and give thanks, which is what the word Eucharist means. It means thanksgiving. For them to just take and go and get out to their car, because, it's really important that they get into that street 3 minutes before everyone else in the parking lot, It's the most important thing of the day. I've never understood that. If I was a priest, I'd lock the doors.
It would probably be a good idea for them to say the Mass is not over.
Yeah, it's
because they don't get the final blessing.
Yeah,
so is that the fulfillment?
It's certainly it's probably one of the largest shows of ingratitude a Catholic could make. That Christ has made Himself present to you, to us, whoever, to receive Him, and you've got to hope that the fact is that they're just ignorant and they don't understand what's going on. Anybody who really believes that that was Jesus and they just need to get out in the car in a hurry, something's really wrong there if that's the case. So,
it would probably be good for us then to help them understand what they're doing.
Absolutely. You might consider those people the passers-by. Give them a gentle reminder. Ask the priest in your parish to put, for 4 Sundays in a row, put a little announcement in the bulletin in really big font. Stay in your seat. Thanks very much. Hi, what's your name?
Robert from Berkeley.
Hi, Robert. What's your question?
When a person feels pain and suffering during prayer and finds himself crying a lot while praying the rosary and feels deep, deep sadness, what is happening in that person?
I would say that God is, there are probably a number of things, but the first thing that pops into my mind, this isn't church teaching, this is just my opinion, is that God is giving that person an opportunity, a great grace to be able to share in His suffering. A lot of people have this impression that prayer is like, woo, oh yeah, la, 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 la. Jesus writhed on the ground in the garden praying. And His prayer wasn't answered. Father, take this cup away from me. So when He was on the cross, He cried out the prayer, my God, why have you abandoned me? So the idea that prayer is always this good, uplifting little shot in the arm, hey, I feel good, is preposterous. Prayer is communicating with God, raising our soul to God. And in that sense, if God wants to, at that point, have us have the great grace of being able to share in His suffering on this earth, that's probably at least as holy, if not more holy, than sharing in His joy. Because that suffering is being used to help save souls.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Frank.
How you doing? I got my question for you again.
Yes.
I know a lot of parishes nowadays offer Eucharistic adoration, either perpetual adoration or once a week, once a month. But I have not seen very many people there to take advantage of this. Could you explain to people who have not participated in Eucharistic adoration what you actually do at Eucharistic adoration?
Okay, this is going to, you might have to take notes on this. At Eucharistic adoration, we adore.
Yeah, but
there are different ways. What's important here is that there's a long tradition in the devotional life of the church of something called a holy hour, and it comes from the Gospels when Jesus said to the apostles in the garden, could you not stay awake with me for 1 hour? And there are some very, very, very holy, sainted people, men and women in the church, have long said that it doesn't really matter what you do during adoration. You can say your rosary, you can say certain prayers of adoration, you can sit there and read the scriptures, you can just sit there and be with God. What's important is to be there. What you're doing there or how you are choosing to adore is really sort of a personal decision, because it's your personal time with Christ. There's one thing we have that this is called a chaplet of Eucharistic adoration. They're available all over the place. This is a nice prayer. Takes probably, it's not a rosary. Looks like a rosary. It's not a rosary. It just looks like one. And you just say a few prayers. There's 2 different prayers you say here, and it just is to focus your mind on the real presence of our blessed Lord in the Eucharist. Reading scriptures would be a wonderful thing. What better place to read scriptures than sitting right in front of the man who wrote them? And asking for the infusion of grace so that you can better understand what something is. You don't have to speed read through a gospel. Just sit there and just read one passage, read one account of something, and then close it and let Jesus talk to you. There's 100 different ways to spend time in front of Christ. But I do want to say one thing, because I know some people actually have this a little different. When we walk into church, we should always genuflect, which is Latin meaning bend the knee singular. When Jesus is exposed, when he's in a monstrance and it's exposition, and you actually see the host in adoration, you should do what we call as a double genuflection, meaning get on, if you're capable, if you're able, to get on both knees, because you're in the presence of God. Not that you're not in the other ways, but here it's you and him, mano a mano, right there. And there isn't really anything else we can do. That's why God gave us our bodies. He gave us our bodies so that we can worship him in soul and body. And what better way to do it?
Thank you much.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
Deacon James Wilder from Assumption Grotto Parish in Detroit. Michael, a very Orthodox parish, just like your show is very Orthodox.
And I'm getting asked a question by a deacon. Uh-oh.
Well,
make it easy.
it's a simple one. What happens to people, Michael, who don't eat the body of Christ but choose to walk away instead?
If you do not eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. He who eats my body and drinks my blood has life within him, and I will raise him up on the last day. I'm just going to let Jesus speak to that one.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. We'll be right back right after this. Welcome back. The powers in the control room have told me to remind you that if you want to find out much more about the Eucharist and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that you should go to our webpage, theonetruefaith.tv, and look for the resources section. And on there you'll find many of the documents we've been talking about from the popes and the different church beliefs and the history of the church. All of the information about the church, well, a lot of it, is there at theonetruefaith.tv. You can see it right down there. And it's the resources section. Click on there. In closing, I'd like to tell you an example of what happens with the Eucharist. A few weeks back, we got a call during one of our shows from a gentleman who identified himself as a sex addict. And he was having all sorts of problems, and he couldn't overcome this struggle. He called during the show three times during the show, asking if there was any way we could help him. What should he do? His life was a wreck. He was older. He just felt absolutely helpless. Well, I talked to him for a little while after the show, and then when the show was, after I got done talking with him, I called probably, I don't know how many people, probably 6, 7, 8 people. And that was later at night, because the show aired late at night in the market that we're talking about. And so everybody couldn't get out of bed essentially and bolt off to the Adoration Chapel, but everybody said a rosary for him. And everybody on staff and some friends that I called said a rosary for him, and I went to the Adoration Chapel for him with the prayers of everyone else spiritually there. And since that phone call and all of those prayers, he's still struggling, he's still having a hard time with it, but he sees a light now at the end of the tunnel that he did not see before he picked up that phone and called us. And I've had the great pleasure on every time I talk to him, and I've talked to him a few times after that, of actually wrapping up and saying, just before we say goodnight, saying the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, and a good act of contrition. And to this point, he hasn't engaged in anything that has been his particular cross. And he says prayers, and he turns on EWTN, and he gets tapes, and he listens to things, and he is, whoever it was earlier that asked about the passersby, there you go. Be available. If we're people of the Eucharist, other people will become people of the Eucharist. It is Satan that we are fighting, make no mistake about it. And the strongest weapon a Catholic has in his hands is his devotion to our Blessed Lord in the Eucharist. He who eats my body and drinks my blood has life eternal, and I will raise you up on the last day.
Oh